Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Baton Rouge. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. On the morning of August 23, 1848, a local merchant by the name of Richard Caldwell was making his way down the muddy path along the eastern banks of the Mississippi River, just outside the growing settlement of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The air was thick with humidity, as was common during late summer in the region. What caught his attention and what would later become the first documented piece of evidence in the Witmore Brousard case was an abandoned carriage, its wheel partially submerged in the soft riverbank mud. Inside the carriage, Caldwell found nothing but a single glove, a man's leather ledger with no entries, and peculiarly a silver locket containing no photograph. The carriage bore the insignia of the Witmore Plantation, one of the larger estates some 5 mi east of the city. By noon that same day, when Caldwell reported his finding to the Baton Rouge constable, it was noted that no one from the Witmore household had been into town for nearly 3 weeks. It was not uncommon for plantation owners to remain on their property for extended periods, especially during harvest seasons. However, Samuel Witmore was known to be particularly meticulous about his weekly visits to the First Bank of Baton Rouge every Thursday without fail. According to bank records accessed during the subsequent investigation, Witmore had missed 3 consecutive appointments without sending word. The constable, James Harrington, dispatched 2 deputies to the Witmore plantation later that afternoon. What they discovered there would become the foundation of one of the most disturbing documented cases in the history of East Baton Rouge Parish. A case that, for reasons that will become apparent, was deliberately kept from official records for nearly 70 years. According to the deputy's initial report, the main house appeared to be in perfect order. The 27 slaves who worked the cotton fields continued their labor as if nothing were amiss. The house servants maintained their duties. Meals had been prepared and served, beds had been made. It was as if the Witmore family was simply elsewhere on the property, but they weren't. Samuel Witmore, age 46, his wife Elizabeth, age 42, and their 3 adult children. Thomas, age 23, Catherine, age 20, and William, age 18, were nowhere to be found. The only member of the household who seemed out of place was Adeline Brousard, a house slave of approximately 30 years of age, who, according to the other servants, had taken to sitting motionless in the parlor when not attending to her duties. When questioned by the deputies, none of the slaves reported anything unusual. Each one provided the exact same response delivered in almost identical wording. Master Witmore has gone to visit his brother in Natchez. He is expected back before the harvest. Samuel Witmore had no brother in Natchez. According to all available records, he had no brothers at all. Over the following weeks, an investigation was quietly conducted. The neighboring plantation owners were consulted. The Witmore family's absence was acknowledged, but curiously none expressed concern. Like the slaves on the property, they all seemed to accept without question that the family had simply gone away temporarily. When pressed, they became uncomfortable and changed the subject. Parish records from September 1848 indicate that a more formal investigation was quietly initiated by Judge Martin Lambert, who had been a business associate of Samuel Witmore. It was Lambert who first noted what he called the strange silence that seemed to hang over the entire Witmore case. "It is not merely that the family has disappeared," he wrote in his private journal discovered decades later. "It is that no one seems to want to speak of it. It is as if the community has collectively agreed to look away." By October of 1848, with the Witmore family still missing, the plantation continued to operate as if nothing were amiss. The harvest proceeded on schedule. Cotton was collected, processed, and shipped to market. Profits were deposited in the Witmore account at the First Bank of Baton Rouge. According to bank records, the deposits were authorized by a signature matching Samuel Witmore's, though the man himself was never seen. It was during this period that reports first began to emerge regarding Adeline Brousard's behavior. The house slave, who had previously been noted as sitting motionless in the parlor, was now observed by other servants to be occupying the master bedroom. According to hushed accounts that were later documented by Lambert, she had taken to wearing Elizabeth Witmore's clothes and jewelry. More disturbing were the reports that Adeline had begun to speak as if she were Mrs. Witmore, giving orders in a perfect imitation of the missing woman's voice and mannerisms. The other house slaves, apparently fearful, complied without question. In his private notes, Judge Lambert described interviewing a field slave named Moses who had been caught attempting to flee the plantation in early November. Moses, before being returned to the Witmore property, allegedly told Lambert there ain't no witters no more. Miss Adeline says there never was. The judge noted that after Moses was returned to the plantation, the man was never seen again. His disappearance was explained away as a successful escape attempt despite the doubled patrols that had been established following his first attempt. By December of 1848, a strange pattern had emerged. The Witmore plantation continued to function. Business transactions occurred, cotton was sold, supplies were purchased, yet the family remained absent. More troubling were the reports from the few tradespeople and merchants who visited the property. They described being greeted by Adeline Brousard, who now openly presented herself as Mrs. Witmore. According to one account by a milliner who had come to deliver hats ordered months earlier by Elizabeth Witmore, the Negro woman received me in the parlor dressed in Mrs. Witmore's clothing. She spoke with perfect diction and addressed me as if we had met many times before. When I inquired after Mrs. Witmore, the woman looked at me strangely and said, "I am Mrs. Witmore." What disturbed me most was not her claim, but rather how naturally she seemed to inhabit the role. Judge Lambert, increasingly troubled by the situation, attempted to organize a more thorough investigation in January 1849. His efforts were stymied at every turn. Local officials expressed reluctance to interfere with what they characterized as private plantation matters. Fellow judges advised him to let the matter rest. It was during this period that Lambert began to document what he described as a conspiracy of silence surrounding the Witmore case. In a letter to his brother in New Orleans, discovered after Lambert's death in 1852, he wrote, "Something has happened here that no one wishes to acknowledge. It is as if speaking of it might make it real, so they choose instead to look away and pretend." The most disturbing development came in February 1849 when a daguerreotype was taken at the Witmore plantation during a gathering of neighboring plantation owners. The image, which surfaced in a private collection in 1931, shows what appears to be a formal dinner party. Seated at the head of the table is not Samuel Witmore but Adeline Brousard, dressed in fine clothes. More unsettling is the fact that none of the white guests seated around her seemed to find anything unusual about the arrangement. According to an analysis of the image conducted by Dr. Harold Bennett of Tulane University in 1934, the expressions on the faces of the dinner guests betray no discomfort or awareness that anything is amiss. They are engaged in conversation, smiling, raising glasses. The African-American woman in Elizabeth Witmore's clothing is being treated as if she were indeed the lady of the house. By March 1849, Judge Lambert's inquiries had attracted unwanted attention. He reported receiving anonymous threats. His house was vandalized. In April, he was removed from the bench on charges of mental instability. Shortly thereafter, he relocated to New Orleans, taking with him his private records of the Witmore investigation. The most comprehensive account of what may have happened to the Witmore family comes from an unexpected source. In 1865, following the end of the Civil War, a former slave from the neighboring Bradford plantation named Isaiah Cooper provided testimony to a Union Army officer documenting conditions in the recently liberated territories. Cooper's account, preserved in military archives until 1948, describes events that occurred on the night of August 1, 1848, 3 weeks before Richard Caldwell discovered the abandoned Witmore carriage. According to Cooper, who claimed to have been present at the Witmore plantation that night, it had been building for years. Master Witmore, he had a particular cruelty about him, not the kind that leaves marks on the body, but the kind that breaks something inside. And Miss Adeline, she suffered more than most. Cooper described Adeline Brousard as having been purchased by Samuel Witmore in 1842. She had previously been owned by a French family in New Orleans, was educated, and spoke both English and French fluently. Witmore, according to Cooper's account, had purchased her specifically to serve as his wife's personal maid, but had other intentions. What Master Witmore did to Miss Adeline over those years, it changed her, Cooper stated, not all at once but slowly, like water dripping on stone. There was a day when something in her eyes just wasn't there anymore. The night of August 1st began, according to Cooper, with an elaborate dinner prepared by Adeline. The entire Witmore family was present. By Cooper's account, nothing seemed unusual until after the meal, when the family began to display signs of distress. They was grabbing at their throats, their eyes bulging. Master Witmore, He looked straight at Miss Adeline like he finally understood something, and Miss Adeline, she just sat there watching them all, calm as still water. Cooper's testimony suggests that Adeline Brousard poisoned the entire Witmore family at dinner that evening. What happened next, however, transitions from the disturbing to the nearly incomprehensible. Miss Adeline, she gathered all the house slaves in the kitchen. She told them, "The Witmores have gone to visit family in Natchez. I will be managing the household in their absence." And then this is what I still can't make sense of. Everyone just nodded like this was perfectly normal, like they hadn't just seen what I'd seen. Cooper described how Adeline methodically organized the disposal of the bodies, directing several trusted field slaves to bury the Witmore family in the swampland at the far eastern edge of the property, an area rarely visited due to its unfavorable conditions. After that night, Cooper continued, "It was like the Witters had never existed, Miss Adeline. She started wearing Mrs. Witmore's clothes, sleeping in their bed. At first just around the slaves, but then when visitors would come, she'd receive them just like she was the lady of the house." The most disturbing element of Cooper's testimony was his description of how the neighboring plantation owners and Baton Rouge society responded to this extraordinary situation. The white folks, they'd come to dinner, sit at her table, converse with her like she was one of them. It wasn't that they were fooled, they knew who she was. It was like they chose not to see what was happening. Like it was easier to pretend. Cooper's account suggests a collective delusion or perhaps a collective agreement that allowed the white society of Baton Rouge to interact with Adeline Brousard as if she were Elizabeth Witmore, rather than confront the horrifying alternative that an enslaved woman had murdered her owners and taken their place. To Judge Lambert, in his final known writing on the subject before his death, perhaps best articulated the psychology at work. "They cannot acknowledge what has happened without acknowledging what preceded it, and that it seems the one thing they cannot bear to face. The historical record becomes increasingly fragmented after 1850. The Witmore Plantation continued to operate, apparently under Adeline Brousard's management, though all official documents bore Samuel Witmore's signature. Business associates who had known Witmore for years conducted transactions through Adeline, referring to her in correspondence as the representative of the Witmore interests. In 1853, a fire destroyed most of the main house at the Witmore Plantation. No deaths were reported. The property was rebuilt on a more modest scale. Operations continued. The onset of the Civil War in 1861 disrupted cotton production throughout the South. Records from this period are scarce, but property tax documents indicate that the Witmore Plantation remained active, though at reduced capacity. Following the Union victory and the emancipation of slaves, the Witmore property, like many Southern plantations, faced an uncertain future. What makes this case unique is that there was no white owner to either abandon the property or attempt to transition to a new labor model. According to local land records, in 1866, the Witmore Plantation was formally transferred to a Mrs. Adelaide White, described in documents as a free woman of color. The transaction was processed by the same bank that had handled the Witmore accounts for decades. There is no further mention of Adeline Brousard in any official capacity after this point. Adelaide White appears in census records from 1870 as the owner of a modest but productive farm on what had once been Witmore land. She's described as a widow with no children. The most unsettling postscript to this story comes from a series of interviews conducted in 1929 by folklorist Margaret Dunnar, who was collecting oral histories throughout Louisiana. Dunnar interviewed several elderly residents of East Baton Rouge Parish, including a 94-year-old woman named Josephine Taylor, who claimed to have been a house slave at a neighboring plantation during the Witmore incident. Taylor's account largely corroborated Isaiah Cooper's testimony, but added one significant detail. According to Taylor, the conspiracy of silence surrounding the events at the Witmore Plantation extended far beyond simple fear or denial. It wasn't just that they pretended not to see, Taylor told Dunnar. Some of them, the wives especially, they understood. They'd sit with her, take tea with her, discuss household matters, all the while knowing exactly who she was and what she'd done, and in their eyes there was something like admiration. When asked to elaborate, Taylor reportedly said, "There were other wives who wished they could do what she did, not just to be free, but to make the ones who hurt them pay. They lived through her. That's why they protected her. That's why they saw her as Mrs. Witmore, because in another world maybe they could have done what she did." The final documented reference to the Witmore case appears in a private letter written in 1936 by Edward Lambert, grandson of Judge Martin Lambert, to a colleague at Louisiana State University's History Department. In it, he declines a request to publish his grandfather's notes on the case. "Some stories once told cannot be untold," he wrote. "My grandfather spent the remainder of his life haunted not by what happened at the Witmore plantation, but by what it revealed about the society in which he lived. Some truths are too terrible to acknowledge, and so we construct elaborate fictions to avoid them. The Witmore case is not just a story about one family and one woman, but about an entire society's capacity for self-deception." Adelaide White died in 1882. According to parish records, she was buried in a small cemetery on what had once been the eastern edge of the Witmore plantation. Her grave marker, documented in a 1954 survey of historical sites in the parish, bore only a name and 2 dates. In 1962, during construction of what would later become Interstate 10, workers excavating in the swampland that had once been part of the Witmore property discovered human remains. According to the brief police report, 5 skeletons were recovered: 2 adult males, 1 adult female, and 2 individuals of indeterminate gender. The remains were estimated to have been buried for over 100 years. No further investigation was conducted. The remains were eventually buried in an unmarked section of Highland Cemetery. The land that once constituted the Witmore plantation has since been subdivided, developed, and incorporated into the expanding city of Baton Rouge. Nothing remains of the original structures. No historical markers commemorate the events that took place there. If not for the scattered documents, private journals, and oral histories that survived, the story of Samuel Witmore and Adeline Brousard might have disappeared entirely. One more silence in a history filled with them. What makes this case so disturbing is not just the acts themselves, but how an entire community could collectively agree to accept an impossible fiction rather than confront an unbearable truth. It reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying aspect of human nature is not what we do, but what we choose not to see. Today, if you drive along Interstate 10, just east of Baton Rouge, you pass directly over the ground where the Witmore family was buried. Thousands traverse this route daily, unaware of what lies beneath. Like the society that once chose not to see Adeline Brousard sitting in Elizabeth Witmore's place, we move through landscapes haunted by histories we have collectively agreed to forget. But some stories refuse to remain buried. They find their way back to the surface like bodies in shallow graves after heavy rain. They whisper to us from old documents and faded photographs. They remind us that the most disturbing horrors are not supernatural but entirely human. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all, how many other Adeline Brousards have been erased from our history? How many other unbearable truths have we collectively agreed not to see? The final entry in Judge Lambert's journal, dated January 18, 1852, just 3 months before his death, reads simply, "What frightens me most is not that such things can happen. It is that we can look directly at them and see nothing at all." In 1965, Dr. Adeline Pritchard, a historian specializing in antebellum Louisiana, attempted to publish a comprehensive study of the Witmore case. Her research, drawing on many of the same sources cited here, was met with resistance from both academic institutions and local historical societies. Her manuscript was rejected by 14 publishers before being indefinitely shelved. Not out of shame for the institution of slavery, which has been well documented and acknowledged, but because the Witmore case represents something far more threatening, a complete inversion of the established order that was tacitly accepted by the very society it subverted. Perhaps most revealing was the response Pritchard received from the East Baton Rouge Historical Society when she requested access to any records they might have pertaining to the Witmore family or their plantation. In correspondence with a colleague at Tulane University, Pritchard wrote, "There remains in certain circles an active desire to suppress this history." The Society's director replied with a brief note stating, "No such family is recorded in our archives. This deliberate eraser extends beyond mere historical oversight." As recently as 1958, when the remains of what was likely the original Witmore plantation house's foundation were uncovered during construction work, local newspapers reported the discovery as colonial-era ruins of unknown origin. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence supporting the veracity of the Witmore-Brousard case emerged in 1966 when renovations to the First Bank of Baton Rouge building uncovered a hidden compartment in what had once been the bank manager's office. Inside was a leather portfolio containing bank transaction records dating from 1848 to 1853. These documents, now held in the Louisiana State Archives but accessible only by special permission, include ledger entries for the Witmore account signed in two distinctly different hands, both purporting to be Samuel Witmore. Graphologists who later examined these signatures confirmed that the earlier ones match known examples of Samuel Witmore's handwriting from before August 1848, while the later signatures appear to be skillful imitations. More telling are the subtle changes in the accounts management after August 1848. Prior to this date, withdrawals were primarily for business expenses, with regular transfers to merchants in New Orleans and textile manufacturers in Massachusetts. After this date, while the plantation's operations continued, new patterns emerged: smaller, regular withdrawals of cash and, most notably, the purchase of several medical texts and French-language books from a New Orleans bookstore. In 1850, the account shows payment to a tutor from New Orleans, described in the ledger as providing educational services on the plantation twice weekly. This same year, there are records of payments to a dressmaker, a jeweler, and an importer of fine goods from France, expenses more consistent with the establishment of a new identity than the maintenance of an existing household. The bank records also reveal that in 1851, the Witmore account funded the purchase of freedom papers for 3 individuals described only as former property of neighboring estates. This remarkable transaction, a slave owner using plantation profits to free other planters' slaves, went apparently unremarked upon by bank officials. Perhaps most significant is a notation from November 1852 regarding the establishment of a separate account in the name of a white with an initial deposit transferred from the Witmore holdings. This marks the beginning of the financial transition that would eventually lead to the formal transfer of property to Adeline White in 1866. These financial records paint a picture not of a sudden violent rupture in the social order, but rather of a methodical, patient reconstruction of identity, one that required the complicity, or at least the willful blindness, of numerous officials, merchants, and community members over a period of years. The question that has haunted researchers for decades is, how was this possible? How could a slave woman not only murder her owners, but assume the social position of the plantation mistress, however imperfectly, without facing immediate discovery and punishment? Dr. Marcus Freeman, in his 1953 analysis of antebellum power structures, suggested that the very rigidity of the slave society paradoxically created the conditions for its subversion. The system was so predicated on absolute racial categories that when confronted with a situation that defied those categories, many simply could not process what they were seeing. It was easier to participate in a collective fiction than to acknowledge a reality that threatened the entire foundation of their society. This theory is supported by fragmentary accounts from the period. A letter from Eliza Bradford, wife of a neighboring plantation owner, to her sister in Virginia, dated October 1849, makes a bleak reference to the unusual situation at the W estate, noting that we have all found it more convenient to accept what we are presented with than to inquire too deeply into matters better left undisturbed. The collective silence extended beyond the white community. Isaiah Cooper's testimony suggests that the slaves on the Witmore plantation, with few exceptions, also participated in maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed, that the Witmore family was merely away and would return. This complicity may have stemmed from fear, but Cooper's account hints at something more complex: a shared understanding that to acknowledge Adeline's actions would bring swift and terrible retribution, not just to her, but to all of them. We all knew, Cooper told the Union officer, every slave on that plantation knew, but to speak it would be to destroy it, and some of us, we wanted to see how far it could go, how long the white folks would choose not to see what was right before them. The daguerreotype from February 1849 remains perhaps the most disturbing artifact of the case. The image, subjected to modern analysis in 1969, confirms that the woman seated at the head of the table is indeed of African descent, though dressed in the finest European fashion of the period. More remarkable are the expressions on the faces of the white dinner guests, not disgust or fear, but what appears to be genuine social engagement. Dr. Catherine Monroe, a psychologist who studied the case in the 1970s, suggested that the dinner guests may have been experiencing a phenomenon she termed selective reality, a form of collective dissociation, where a group agrees without explicitly stating so to perceive a situation in a way that preserves their understanding of how the world should function. Rather than see a former slave who had murdered her owners and usurped their position, a reality too threatening to their entire worldview, they saw what their minds could accept. A somewhat unusual but still recognizable social scenario where they were dining with the representative of the Witmore family. Monroe wrote, "The human mind is remarkably adept at reframing reality when the alternative is too psychologically damaging to contemplate." This theory is given credence by accounts from the period that describe interactions with Adeline Brousard Adelaide White in curiously ambiguous terms. A business associate of the Witmore Plantation wrote in 1850 of meeting with the lady of the house who speaks for Witmore interests with remarkable clarity and understanding for one of her station. The deliberate ambiguity of her station reveals both awareness and denial. What emerges from these fragments is the portrait of a community engaged in an elaborate performance, one where everyone knew their lines but never acknowledged the script. Plantation owners, merchants, bankers, and slaves all participated in maintaining a fiction that allowed them to navigate a situation that acknowledged directly would have required violent resolution. The story of what happened in the years after the Civil War offers its own disturbing insights. Adelaide White's transition from representing the Witmore interests to legally owning the property herself coincides with the broader social upheaval of Reconstruction. In this period of tremendous change and uncertainty, the fiction that had been maintained for nearly 2 decades could finally be partially resolved, not through acknowledgement of the truth, but through its transformation into a new, more acceptable narrative. Adelaide White appears in the 1870 census as a widow and property owner of mixed race. Her neighbors, according to tax records, included former plantation owners, now farming smaller parcels of their once vast holdings. The fiction evolved. No longer the white plantation mistress, she became instead a free woman of color who had somehow acquired property, unusual but not impossible in the Reconstruction era. Church records from St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Baton Rouge list Adelaide White as a congregant and contributor from 1867 until her death. The same church records make no mention of Adeline Brousard, nor of the Witmore family, despite their prominence in the community for decades before their disappearance. The most poignant artifact from Adelaide White's later years is a daguerreotype taken approximately 1875, discovered in 1948, in the possession of a family descended from formerly enslaved people on the neighboring Bradford Plantation. It shows an elderly woman of African descent dressed plainly, but with dignity, seated in a chair on the porch of a modest farmhouse. According to notes accompanying the image, the woman was known locally as Madame White and was respected for her knowledge of herbal medicine and her willingness to treat both black and white residents of the area. The notes make no mention of her past, stating only that she came into her property after the war and was known to help former slaves establish themselves with small loans and gifts of seed and livestock. If this image indeed depicts Adeline Brousard in her final incarnation as Adelaide White, it suggests that she managed not only to survive, but to establish a new identity that allowed her to live openly, if not entirely honestly, until her death. The transformation from enslaved woman to plantation mistress to respected landowner represents an extraordinary navigation of the treacherous racial and social hierarchies of 19th century Louisiana. Adelaide White died on September 12, 1882. According to parish records, the cause of death is listed as complications of age. Her will, a remarkably detailed document for someone who had once been property rather than a property owner, distributed her modest estate among several families in the area, many of whom were formerly enslaved. The will makes no reference to her life before emancipation. The small cemetery where Adelaide White was buried was relocated in 1959 to make way for highway construction. Her remains, along with others from the cemetery, were moved to Highland Cemetery in Baton Rouge. According to cemetery records, her grave marker, a simple stone bearing the inscription Adelaide White, 1833 to 1882 at rest, was not among those successfully relocated. Today, her final resting place is unmarked. In the decades since, the Witmore-Brousard case has remained a footnote in Louisiana history, referenced occasionally in academic texts but rarely examined in detail. The reasons for this continued obscurity are not difficult to discern. The The case presents uncomfortable truths about power, race, and collective delusion that remain relevant today. Dr. Adeline Pritchard, whose attempt to publish a comprehensive study of the case in the 1960s was unsuccessful, wrote in her personal journal, "The Witmore case is not merely a historical curiosity. It's a mirror in which we might see our own capacity for self-deception, our own willingness to embrace comfortable fictions rather than confront disturbing truths." This observation gains particular resonance when we consider how the physical evidence of the case has been systematically erased from the landscape. The Witmore plantation house burned and rebuilt was eventually demolished. The land was subdivided and developed. The graves were paved over. The documents were hidden away or destroyed. Even the final resting place of the woman at the center of the story was lost to time. Yet the story persists, passed down through fragments of documents, oral histories, and the occasional academic study. It survives because, despite all efforts to erase it, it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and social structures. In 1964, during an interview conducted as part of the Federal Writers Project, a 101-year-old woman named Clara Johnson, who had been born into slavery in East Baton Rouge Parish, was asked if she remembered anything about the Witmore plantation or its owners. After a long silence, Johnson replied, "Some stories ain't meant to be told straight out. Some stories get told in the spaces between words, in the things people don't say." That Witmore place, folks knew what happened there. They just found it easier to look away, and sometimes looking away is its own kind of seeing. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Witmore-Brousard case is not the initial violence, the poisoning of a family by an enslaved woman pushed beyond endurance. It is the response to that violence, a community's decision to participate in a fiction rather than confront a reality that threatened their understanding of the world. This collective self-deception, this agreement to see what could not exist rather than acknowledge what did, reveals how fragile our social constructs can be, and how desperately we will work to maintain them, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. In 1968, a final piece of the puzzle emerged when a collection of letters was discovered during renovations to an old home in the Garden District of New Orleans. The letters, written between 1848 and 1851, were correspondence between Elizabeth Witmore's sister Caroline Beaumont and her husband, who was serving as a diplomat in France during this period. In these letters, Caroline makes several references to her concerns about her sister's family. In September 1848, she writes, "I have received no word from Elizabeth since my letter of July. I have written twice more and dispatched a messenger to the plantation, but have been informed that the family is traveling. I find this most unlike my sister, who has never been fond of leaving home." By November, her concern had grown. "I attempted to call at the plantation myself, but was received by Elizabeth's maid, Adeline, who insisted that the family remained away on business. There was something in her manner that disturbed me greatly, though I cannot say precisely what. She spoke as Elizabeth might, used expressions familiar to my sister. When I pressed her on when the family might return, she smiled in a way that chilled me and said, 'They are never coming back, but we need not speak of that.'" Most revealing is Caroline's letter from January 1849. "I have shared my concerns with Judge Lambert, who agrees that something is terribly wrong. Yet, when we attempt to raise the alarm, we are met with indifference or hostility. It is as if no one wishes to acknowledge that anything is amiss." Even more disturbing, I called upon the Bradfords, who claimed to have dined with my sister just the week before. When I insisted that this could not be true, Mrs. Bradford became quite cold and suggested that perhaps I was unwell. Caroline's final letter regarding the matter, dated March 1849, reveals her growing isolation. "I find myself increasingly unwelcome in Baton Rouge society. My questions about Elizabeth and her family are met with silence or outright hostility. Even Judge Lambert now suggests that I should let the matter rest. I am beginning to question my own mind. Is it possible that I am indeed unwell, that I have imagined a mystery where none exists? And yet I know my sister. I know she would never leave without word to me. Something terrible has happened at that plantation, but it seems I am alone in my certainty." Shortly after this letter, Caroline Beaumont returned to France to join her husband. There is no record of her ever returning to Louisiana. The Witmore case, it seems, claimed not only the lives of the family, but also the peace of mind of those who could not accept the collective fiction. In 24 additional letters discovered in the same collection, Caroline never again mentions her sister or the Witmore family. It is as if, unable to resolve the contradiction between what she knew and what society insisted was true, she chose to excise the matter entirely from her correspondence, if not from her thoughts. This willful forgetting, this deliberate looking away extends beyond the individuals directly involved to encompass the broader historical record. The systematic erasure of the Witmore-Brousard case from official histories represents another kind of violence, the violence of omission that allows comfortable narratives to prevail over uncomfortable truths. Yet despite these efforts at erasure, the story has survived in fragments of documents, in oral histories, in the occasional academic study brave enough to confront its implications. It survives because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and the societies we construct. The story of Samuel Witmore and Adeline Brousard is not merely a tale of murder and deception. It is a case study in collective delusion, in the human capacity to see what we need to see rather than what is before us. It reminds us that reality is not merely what exists, but what we are willing to acknowledge. Perhaps most unsettling is the realization that this capacity for collective self-deception is not confined to the past. We too participate in fictions that allow us to maintain our understanding of how the world functions. We too look away from truths that threaten our sense of order. And like the society that chose not to see Adeline Brousard sitting in Elizabeth Witmore's place, we may not recognize our own delusions until long after they have shaped our reality. The final word on the Witmore-Brousard case might belong to Judge Martin Lambert, who wrote in his journal shortly before his death. The most terrifying aspect of this affair is not what it reveals about Adeline Brousard or even about the institution of slavery. It is what it reveals about us all, our willingness to embrace a lie rather than face a truth that disturbs our sense of order. I fear this tendency lies dormant in every human heart, waiting for the moment when reality becomes too painful to bear. Today, the city of Baton Rouge has grown around and over the land where these events took place. Modern highways, shopping centers, and subdivisions have erased all physical evidence of the Witmore plantation. Thousands pass daily over ground that once witnessed an extraordinary subversion of the antebellum social order. Like the society that chose to participate in Adeline Brousard's fiction, we move through landscapes haunted by histories we have collectively agreed to forget. But some stories refuse to remain buried. They find their way back to the surface like bodies in shallow graves after heavy rain. They whisper to us from old documents and faded photographs. They remind us that the most disturbing horrors are not supernatural but entirely human, and that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not those we can see, but those we refuse to acknowledge.